Twisted Jenius presents Developing in the Dark with False Prophet.
Hello, minions of the internet. I am False Prophet, and we are once again developing in the dark. Now, as we get more and more into our own horror game development here, our own endeavor, by the way, the game is called Terrorgasm. Yes, we're going to be discussing a lot more about that later. But for right now, I've been researching horror games more and trying to kind of ponder this idea. What does it take to make a really good quality horror game? Something that people will actually want to play, something that people will like, something that will sell a lot of copies. And what I've come to kind of an interesting realization about this. Just a little distinction that I think may be helpful for anyone else in the industry who wants to know, who's interested in this idea. And by the way, what I'm actually about to discuss does not just apply to horror games. It seems to actually apply to gaming in general, video game industry in general. That's why I think this is significant. But it's something that I came across specifically with the horror genre. And what this is, basically, is that people are very, very judgmental of a game's gameplay. Oh, right. Captain Obvious, yes, obviously. What else are people going to judge a game on? Obviously, people do care about the gameplay. But here's the thing. What I'm actually noticing is that it seems that people's gameplay experience, the experience that they have, their feeling, their emotional state, while playing a game, and whether they feel satisfied, whether they feel like the game's play lived up to their expectations of the game, seems to color almost everything else about that game, or about their perception of that game. So what do I mean by this? What I'm saying is that I don't know if other things, such as graphics, for example, matter as much to gamers, to people who play video games, especially after they've begun playing the game. And there's a couple of little case studies here that I'm kind of want to examine, that I've just recently been kind of thinking about and become aware of. These are both horror games that I believe were both funded on Kickstarter. One of them is called Agony, and the other one is called Scorn. Now, I don't believe Scorn has been released yet, but Agony has, and I think there have been some people who have played Scorn who have also reported on what the gameplay is like. And in both of these games' cases, apparently one of the criticisms, the major criticisms of them, is that their gameplay is either considered lackluster or non-existent or just not very good. Now, I'm just going to add the disclaimer that I have not played either of these games. So, and I'm actually not trying to judge them either. I can't judge them really, except for the footage I've seen, which to me is actually looks pretty impressive there. They both seem to be surreal games, which have a very dark, Geiger-esque kind of quality to them. And I personally love that. I think that's awesome. I know that surrealism is not everyone's cup of tea, but I really love it. Just look at our website. We have a whole webcomic called The Snail Factory there, which is very surreal. And I personally love creepy, surreal stuff like that. But one thing I'm noticing is that no one seems to really care about the fact that these games may be cool looking if the gameplay doesn't work very well. And what's really interesting about this is that we know that both of these games were probably funded based on their aesthetic. I'm not sure that anyone had an opportunity to play either of these games before the crowdfunding happened. So any popularity that either of these games might have had came from the fact that they were cool looking. And yet, once people get in there and start playing, if the gameplay doesn't work, then, or isn't to meet their standards, doesn't give them what they really wanted or what they were hoping for, then apparently what really happens there is that the game's aesthetic just suddenly doesn't matter anymore. They don't care if it's cool looking or not. And this is a very important distinction to any game developer out there, because what this means is that it really doesn't matter how much effort you put into the graphics quality of your game if people they don't enjoy playing it, if they don't find the gameplay experience enjoyable, then they're not going to like it regardless. And for horror games specifically, you really run the risk of falling into that dreaded walking sim territory there, or being accused of that. In fact, this is why we actually decided to discontinue the Reptile Zoo project, the previous game that we were working on, because we were afraid it kind of resembled that a little bit too much. It did have some gameplay that actually I'm very proud of, but we also knew that there's a huge stigma among a lot of gamers about this type of game there. And so, as game developers, we wanted to create something that, people actually wanted to play, would be excited about. That's very important. It's about profitability, but it's also about pleasing the audience, because those two things go very much hand in hand in game development. And in fact, even if a game looks really good at first, if players aren't reporting that they like it, if people aren't giving it good reviews, if people aren't talking about it in this day and age, especially in the internet here, it's very difficult for that game to gain any traction or get momentum there. People want a game that's fun, apparently. And this actually seems to go the other way, too. So, for example, some people will excuse a game's poor graphic quality if they enjoy the gameplay. One of the most jarring examples of this, I guess, would be Undertale. This game came out, it was a very popular indie game a few years ago. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. And one thing I could never understand about this game that kind of frustrated me is that the graphics seemed so atrocious by those standards. I mean, those time period standards. And yet people loved this thing. Now, I never played the game, but it was very obvious to me watching this from an industry perspective, from looking at this and trying to kind of deconstruct and evaluate and see what people liked about this game, that it was the way it made them feel. They liked the game's the way it worked. They were willing to ignore the graphics, or lack of graphics there. And this isn't the only example of that. There have been plenty of games that have gotten popular that did not have the best graphic quality, or the most interesting art aesthetic, or the greatest aesthetic or art design. But people are willing to excuse that if the gameplay is compelling, if they enjoy that element of it. And so this provides a very interesting distinction for game developers here. And it tells me that it's very important to put a lot of emphasis on the gameplay, because that seems to be the biggest determining factor in whether someone actually enjoys your game or not. So what's the conclusion here? Are we saying that graphics don't matter at all? Well, of course not. In fact, we know that graphics have a huge impact on a game's perception, especially at first. There's definitely a marketing and advertising element here. And there could be an enjoyability element too. There is a perception, at least, that the graphic quality of a game will speak to other elements of the game's quality. People are willing to look past flaws that they might find in a game if the game made them feel good, if it met their expectations, if they enjoyed themselves. They'll forget about all the terrible things that actually went wrong with it, or only minimize those things. Say, yeah, well, this wasn't perfect, but I still really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And in the same way, and possibly more importantly and more damningly to a game, they will also play up other minor flaws, or even forget about the good aspects of a game if it didn't make them feel good. If the gameplay wasn't what they wanted, or wasn't what they thought it was supposed to be, they will completely start to ignore any of the other good parts of it, and it will all just become kind of crap in their eyes, basically. And this, by the way, doesn't just apply to video games. People do this all the time with everything. This is how human beings work. But it's very important from a game development standpoint to recognize this, that player experience needs to be the most fundamental, most important part of a game's design, because if it's not, if people are not actually enjoying themselves or coming away with their expectations met or the emotions that they were hoping to feel, they're not going to like that game. And as we know about human psychology, human beings are not rational creatures at all. We like to feel things. That's how we process information. Our decision-making is actually based on how we feel, not what we think. We make decisions based on emotion, then back them up with logic. So we have to really emphasize the feeling, and with games, because of their interactive nature, because of how engaged people can become while playing video games, it's very important to remember that the aesthetics are only one small element of this. And this is very weird from a horror standpoint, by the way. As a horror artist, as a creator, as a guy who loves aesthetics, this is kind of a revelation. And I have a feeling that from a game developer standpoint, I'm not the only one who really understands or who had trouble understanding this or who kind of battles with this a little bit. Because I think that when you're developing a game, there's a tendency to want to make things look really cool, and you can get so caught up in that. And as it turns out, players just really want to have a great gameplay experience. Now, I'm not saying there aren't players who are nitpicky about graphics. Of course there are. This is obvious. And certain minimal standards have to be met. But it's also very interesting how some games can really take off and not really look that good. And part of this is also about setting expectations too. So there are definitely ways to kind of set up things so that, okay, this is what the player is expecting, and that has to do with the way the game's presented, that has to do with tutorials, that has to do with the graphics themselves can kind of help to set expectations about what a game might do or what it might not do. And, of course, any other thing you can do about it. Text blurbs technically do that for whoever reads those. I know not everyone reads those, but there's definitely some people who do, and those are very important. Trailers, obviously, are going to set some expectations and mood there. So there are ways to affect that from a developer standpoint, but we always have to keep this in mind. And, by the way, this is a reminder to myself, too. Gameplay does seem to be paramount at the end for anything in the video game medium there. And so I'm also kind of giving a little message to any other devs out there, and also pointing this out to any gamers too. Look at how you evaluate and judge a game. What makes a game really amazing to you? My guess is it's the feelings it gives you. Fortunately, this game that we are working on currently is very, very gameplay focused, and that is why I have a lot of confidence in it right now. And it's very obvious when you look at, let's say, the successful tags on Steam, the kind of games that people like to play on there. We're a PC developer, so this is what we're concerned with. It's very obvious that people are really more concerned about gameplay than almost any other single element of games. Yes, there are lots of other things you have to consider, including art and many other things, sounds, design. People sometimes really like story. If it's a story-based game, I'm not really into those, but a lot of people are very interested in that, and if it claims to be or implies that it's a story-based game and there isn't a whole lot of story, people will get upset about that. But in the end, for a lot of games, the gameplay seems to be really paramount, and so this is where I think that a lot of devs could really excel if they really put a lot of thought into that, because it seems to me that this is what games are really about for a lot of gamers. And so making your gameplay really awesome. And by the way, I say that like it's an easy thing to do. It's not easy at all. I know it's hard, but it's definitely something to strive for, I think. It's definitely something that we should try to push ourselves to do. We may fail, but as developers, we should definitely give it our best shot. Now, the good news is that this is the type of challenge that all developers really have to face. In fact, all creative people, anyone who's in any kind of artistic or creative field of any kind, has to contend with this balance of, what the customer, what the consumer, what the player wants versus the art of it. And even if you're trying to please the customer, guess what? You'll never please everybody. If you try to copy something that worked before, especially in game development, people are going to hate you for it, especially if you copy it too closely. If it's too close, if it's a clone, no one's going to like that. And if you try something different, well, guess what? There's still going to be people who don't like that. So the good news is you don't have to worry about pleasing everyone because it's never going to happen. But you also want to try to please a certain number of people because at least I see game development as very much a commercial art, and that's not a bad thing. If a lot of people don't want to play your game, then that means you're not providing a good enough service for them. You're not creating something that is going to bring enjoyment to enough people there. And I think that's very important to do. I think that if you're going to be engaging game development at all, and this is a really hard process, it can be very challenging. A lot of it is not fun, but if you're going to do this and you're not just having a very time-consuming hobby, then you should really try to bring as much enjoyment to as much people as possible. Now, you still want to stay in your lane, you still want to do something that you're proud of, you still want to do what you know and what's within your capability. But you also want to try to maximize your game design so that as many people as possible can actually enjoy this. And that's really tough. It's something that we've at Twisted Jenius struggled with a lot because we're kind of weird. So, we know that there's only going to be a certain percentage of the population that's ever going to really enjoy our work. But we think that it's very important from a gameplay standpoint to really try to make things enjoyable because, well, that's actually where stuff can shine. That's where innovation can really flourish in game development. Sometimes it's kind of amazing, especially with indie devs, how many indie developers don't seem to do this. They kind of have this idea of a game, but they don't always really think about the end user experience or try to step out of their role as a game dev and think about it from other people's perspective there. And I think that that's a very important thing to do. And it takes effort. Notice a theme here. All this stuff takes effort. But I think that it's something that you should really try to do because it'll create a much better experience and therefore a much better product, a much better game. And not only will that have the opportunity to make you way more money, but it'll also give people more enjoyment, so it's just a win-win situation. And that kind of win-win situation is exactly what any type of commercial product, including games, should really be striving for, in my opinion. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little rant, this little insight into some of what goes into making a game there. If you aren't a game developer and you just enjoy games, you enjoy the industry, then I hope that you got a little something out of this, got some insight into the kind of struggle that we have to deal with. And if you are a game dev, well, I also hope this has sparked some interest in you about trying to figure out what actually works. What do customers, gamers want? Because I think that that's a very important thing to know, and I don't think it's a question that gets asked quite enough to us, to ourselves personally in game development there. Because we all come in with our preconceived notions of what a game is supposed to be. And of course, from a developer standpoint, that experience can be completely different than being a gamer. And I can tell you that because I'm not really a gamer. I am definitely into the development side. I love the art. I love the industry. I love understanding games. But I actually don't play them very much. My programmer, Vicious, he's very much more a gamer than I am, so I do get a lot of insight from him and other people around me. But it's very interesting for me just kind of looking at stuff and seeing what works and what doesn't. That you have to really identify this, and you have to appreciate what people are really looking for and what they want. And these are not easy things to figure out, but it's kind of a never-ending quest. It's the quest that anyone in business has to contend with. What do people really want? If you want to be a working artist of any kind, that's also going to be a thing. What do people really want? What do they like? What can you give them? What do you have to offer them? And these are very important questions, and these are questions that I am sure I will continue to ask, and I hope you will too, no matter what you do for a living, because providing value is pretty much how you make a living. It's how you get around in the world. It's how you connect with people, and that's a really good thing to do. So I hope you'll follow along with us at Twisted Jenius here, because we will be talking more about this game we're working on, Terrorchasm, and trying to create a really awesome horror game for you guys. And yes, it's actually an action horror game, just like our last one. It's got some puzzle platforming and some other interesting stuff, such as killer vegetation. Very cool. Until next time, this is False Prophet saying, stay evil, and good night. You know what? Screw it. Gameplay's too tough. Let's just make movies instead. Oh. Wait, you mean we have to write story for those?